This is the most epic history ever, that if you're a Jesus fan, you want to know this stuff. The Catholic Church erased all of this from the history books. It's the big scandal at the heart of Christianity. All the truths are coming to light, man. It really is an awakening that's happening, almost like an Akashic records unlocking, and now the floodgates have been opened. And I think that that's what the second coming has to really mean, is kind of the awakening, the discovery of the real message of Jesus. Religion corrupts and weaponizes Jesus. And when you go to Jesus himself, you just don't see that same character that religion paints. There's no question in my mind that there's more to the story than we've been told by Christianity with Jesus and Mary. Just like Yeshua kind of represents the Shiva principle, right? The divine masculine. And then Mary would serve as the Shakti. Jesus probably did have a child. There's really good evidence. There's no question what Jesus' soteriology was. Jesus is explicit about this, which in a nutshell is, I'm a third generation pastor's son. I became a full-time pastor at 23 after graduating from Oral Roberts University with my bachelor's in theology. I'm working on my master's right now in biblical studies. And then I got my first church job for a year, had this huge awakening out of religion, realized I just can't reconcile these contradictions anymore. And more importantly, I think, I don't believe in this version of God you're preaching. I don't think this is the God that Jesus revealed. And so leaving my religion was like the worst breakup you can imagine, because again, third generation pastor's son, this runs in my family. I spent my whole life in church, and I loved church, man. It really was my life, my whole identity. So talk about an identity crisis, when I had to leave religion. But that identity crisis drove me to find answers. And one of the things I did was I started to read, because I saw how much religion corrupts and, weaponizes Jesus. And when you go to Jesus himself, you just don't see that same character that religion paints. So I thought, let me just study the teachings of Jesus in isolation. And what if I just didn't have any other writings other than the 4 canonical gospels, let's say? If you gave these 4 gospels to a remote desert tribe on an island somewhere who's never heard of Christianity, and you translate it into their language, and you're like, hey, read these 4 gospels about this man named Jesus. Tell me what you think. Are they going to come away with the mainstream Christian creeds that are believed and practiced by 99.9% of Christians today, such as, in order to be saved, you must confess Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, and his sacrifice will wipe away your sins and you'll not go to hell when you die? They would absolutely never come away with such a conclusion, because Jesus never said any such thing. And when you look for these common Christian axioms, which all of them really come from Paul, not Jesus, you don't find them in Jesus's mouth. You can't find any such soteriology that remotely resembles the Christian religion today. And to this criticism, Christians like to hand wave it away and say, oh, you're just, cherry picking or whatever. And to them, I say, how can you not recognize what a massive problem this is, that you have none of the pillars of your religion from the mouth of Jesus? I mean, we all know that history over time distorts, corrupts, erases, changes, adulterates truth, and original texts get changed by scribes in every tradition we know of. Are we really so sure that Jesus's words and tradition and ideals didn't get changed by dogmatic men over the centuries? Because if they did, we should really want to know, right? And that's maybe my biggest frustration and why I'm so passionate about this message, because it's like, hey, I grew up loving Jesus with all my heart, as Christians claim to. Jesus was the most important thing to me since I can remember, and Jesus was the reason I left religion. The first YouTube video I made about it was titled, Why I Left Christianity for Jesus, because I didn't believe Christianity was giving me a Christ-like version of Jesus. And so I get a little bit frustrated with Christians who try to dismiss this criticism of mine, rather than taking it seriously and saying, hey, this guy is saying that the true original teachings of Yeshua the Nazarene, Jesus Christ we call him now, were changed and corrupted over time. And if we love this man and we believe he was sent from God, we believe he was the Messiah, the Son of God, shouldn't we at least look into this and see if it's true? Isn't that what a real disciple would do? And so that's what I did. And what I found is that Jesus taught a very specific soteriology, which is a branch of theology that teaches about how to get saved. What does that mean to be saved? How does one get saved, and what does it mean? And Jesus is explicit about this. There's no question what Jesus' soteriology was, which in a nutshell is repent and God forgives you. The end. Jesus never taught about God needing blood to forgive people. And in fact, Jesus very much condemned the practice of animal sacrifice and famously cleanses the temple, kicks all the animals out of their cages and says, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." And if you knew what this meant, you wouldn't be condemning the innocent, speaking of the animals. So Jesus didn't seem to be very cool to the idea that God needs blood and never taught such a thing. He said, repent with a humble heart and you go up justified before God, and taught this in numerous parables. And when he was asked directly, Emrit, Rabbi, what must I do to inherit eternal life? It's like, this is the question. Here we go. The Savior has been asked the most important question one can ask a Savior. And what does he say? Does he say what a Christian would say? Does he say what an evangelical pastor would say on Sundays? Does he say what a Catholic priest would say at Mass? He says something that I've never heard a Christian say. He says something I've never heard a Christian pastor or priest or bishop say. And in fact, that I think if you said what Jesus said on a church Sunday service and you preached a sermon about it, the crowd would rise up and point the finger of blasphemy at you. But here's what he said. He said, if you want to enter eternal life, keep the commandments. And then in Matthew's version, he lists off, interestingly, the 5 love your neighbor commandments. So like don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, etc. And then he finishes by saying, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then in a parallel passage, when he's asked, teacher, what is the greatest commandment of all? AKA, how do you get saved, man? Like, what's the real code? And he says, the greatest commandment of all is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The Jewish Shema from Deuteronomy 6. And love your neighbor as yourself. And if you do this one thing, really it's one commandment, you fulfill the entire law. On this hangs the entire law and the prophets. So how do you get that twisted, right? Clearly this is what Jesus thought. And then curiously, if a pastor ever said you get saved by keeping the commandments, he'd be called a heretic for saying so. But that's what Jesus said. And then if you put the words of a Christian pastor in the mouth of Jesus, you have big problems. Or let's just say Paul, actually. Romans 10:9, Paul says, if you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, you will be saved. And Jesus says, not everybody who confesses me as Lord, Lord will enter my kingdom. Many will come to me in that day and say, Lord, Lord, didn't we not prophesy in your name and do mighty works in your name? And he says, I will look at them and say, depart from me, you who practice evil. For when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was thirsty, you didn't give me a drink. When you did not do it to the least of these, you did not do it to me. So that seems like a pretty scathing rebuke from the master, doesn't it? Don't just think you can confess me as Lord, Lord and enter my kingdom. You better follow my greatest commandment, or I don't know who you are. And so that's the overall message we're trying to get across in the Jesus Way podcast to not just the Christian world, but the world at large. Because I think the true Jesus, Yeshua the Nazarene, which has a whole nother history track we can talk about, is a Jesus that everyone from every religion would totally rock with and say, I love that kind of Savior. I love that kind of Messiah who teaches love God, love your neighbor, forgive to be forgiven, repent and God forgives you, keep the commandments. Who's got a problem with that? I mean, that's a unifying religion, if you want to call it one. I definitely don't want to start a new religion, but this is a unifying belief system that I think, this is kind of how Islam sees Jesus, that he was a Messiah who came from God and taught to love God and love neighbor and got crucified for it. This is what the Jewish Christians believed, the tradition of Jesus, for 4 or 5 centuries before the Roman Catholic Church kind of extinguished them. So the world's ready for this message. I really believe that. And we're excited to deliver it with each and every podcast we record.
I would love to learn more about Yeshua the Nazarene. You said this interesting phrase though. You said religion corrupts and weaponizes Jesus. What did you exactly mean by that?
Well, when you look at the history of the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Empire, the tradition that won out was not even the first tradition that there was, nor was it even the second Christian tradition that there was, but the third. And it just so happened to be the most powerful Christian tradition because it ended up having the might of the Roman Empire at its behest.
Politically driven.
And very politically driven. The very first Christians were called Nazarenes, and this is attested to by multiple of the patristics, early church fathers, as early as the 3rd century, that say that the very first Christians were not called Christians. They were called Nazarenes, just like Jesus. And there is a enormous amount of secular and historical proof of this Nazarene sect that shows that it actually predated Christ. In other words, that Yeshua was born into and this is a kind of a sect of Essene type Judaism, called Nazarenes. Now, certain historians show us that the Essenes eventually kind of bifurcated, as all groups do, into 2 different camps by the 1st century, the Essenes to the south and the Nazarenes to the north. And the major dividing issue is over celibacy and marriage. The Nazarenes believed in marriage and reproduction to populate God's kingdom with children. And the Essenes believed that sex was the ultimate, vice for man. It must be avoided at all costs to be truly holy. So they would adopt children and were very generous in adopting, but they didn't procreate. There was no women there and stuff. So these are the 2 sects of Essenes, and Jesus is born into the northern tribe and comes out of, the Galilean Nasara region. And what's interesting is when you study the Nazarenes, and especially the Essenes as well, you see Jesus is speaking and preaching multiple known Essene creeds and axioms and teachings from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that this Essene-type Judaism was actually what Jesus emerged out of, and his sect emerged out of. And so the first Christians were the Nazarenes. And we have, again, an enormous amount of historical attestation that Jesus did not appoint Peter as his successor, as the Catholic Church wrongly claims. Jesus appointed his blood brother, James the Just, as his appointed successor of his church, which was called the Ebionim, the poor ones, or the poor. So this is why Jesus would say, if you want to be my disciple, go sell all you possess to the Ebion, the poor, which was actually the name of his congregation, his group, and then come follow me. It was kind of like the initiation into Jesus's movement is, hey, if you want to prove to us that you really mean what you say, and this is very Essene, by the way, the Essenes had multiple initiation rites people had to pass to prove that they really wanted to be an Essene. There was like a 3-year waiting period that Philo talks about. So you had to really be serious about converting to Essenism. They weren't just like going to take anybody off the streets because they want to keep their tradition very pure, right? So it's very Essene of Jesus to do this, but he was vetting people saying, if you are really serious about this, easy, just prove it to me by giving up all you possess to our community, which was the kind of Acts chapter 2 tells us this was the way the Jesus church was operating, is they were living in what's called voluntary poverty or communal living, where everyone shared everything with the group. No one had any private possessions. And so there was just endless abundance for everybody, but it was all shared abundance. So Jesus is saying, you got to play by our rules, so to speak. So James took over that church for Jesus and almost to 70 AD when he gets martyred. And then James, according to multiple early historical attestations, appointed his brother and Jesus' half-brother, Simeon, as his successor. And then Simeon led the church well into the early 2nd century, around 115 AD, I believe, when he got martyred. And get this, bro. Philo and Josephus, I believe, both say that the average age of an Essene in their time was over 100 years. So maybe like 120 years. So the average age. So these ascetic Jews were extremely healthy, following natural law, bathing in the river twice a day, eating only the fruits of the land and the earth. And they were living extremely long lives, fasting regularly. And so Eusebius writes, quoting from a Jewish Christian historian named Hegesippus, the story of Simeon's martyrdom, when Simeon was captured by, I believe it was the Romans, and he was tortured and killed at 120 years old. So like this is the most epic history ever, that if you're a Jesus fan, you want to know this stuff, that Jesus had a half-brother, the son of his uncle Clopas, who then most likely married Mary after Joseph died, and they had a child together, Simeon. And he was righteous enough that James appointed him as his successor over any of the other disciples he had a choice of. And this guy lived to be 120 years old, and he was running the church, the Nazarene church of Jesus and James, at 120 years old. So he must have had pretty good mental acuity at that age. And it said the Romans were actually impressed by how much torture that he endured before he died, because he was very healthy despite being old. And this is the half-brother of Jesus. Like there was way more enlightenment in Jesus' DNA than just went to Jesus. And the Catholic Church erased all of this from the history books. You'll never be taught this at a Catholic or Christian school, university, church. It's the big scandal at the heart of Christianity that the first Christians were Jewish Christian Nazarenes who did not believe Jesus was God, who incarnated like a Greek demigod like Apollos or Perseus or whatever. They were not Greco-Romans, Gentiles. They were Semitic Jews who believed in the Messiah, the Hamashiach, who was prophesied in all the scriptures to be the son of David. So of the lineage of David, right? So a person with a real person like you and I who is chosen by God and anointed by God. And this is what all the Jewish Christian groups believed up until, again, the 4th or 5th century before they were wiped out. And then the second church tradition that came after them was not the Catholics, but the Gnostics. The Gnostics were a massive populist Christian movement in the Mediterranean region. And most scholars and historians I've studied on this agree that for a certain period of time, there would have been more Gnostic Christians than Orthodox Christians. Because you had at that time, it was like the Wild West of theology. Like everyone's trying to decide, what do we believe about this guy and this Christian message? And the Gnostics say this, the Orthodox say that, the Jewish Christians think they're both heretics. And it's like, which tradition's going to win out? And because the Catholic Church had the might of the Roman Empire and could weaponize law and all of that, they outlawed Nazarene Christianity as Judaizing, saying you can't practice any form of Judaism and be a Christian, or your property is going to be seized and you could be actually executed for it. So all the Nazarene Christians had to flee from the Roman Empire and go find somewhere else to live, and you couldn't practice any Nazarene Christianity after that period under Pope Damasus. And it's like, hey guys, Jesus is listed in the Bible, in the New Testament, as Jesus the Nazarene. And his sect is mentioned in Acts 24:5, the Nazarene sect, the followers of the way. And now we're persecuting the Nazarenes and calling them heretics and wiping them out of history and burning their books. That seems a little bit strange. And unfortunately, Amrit, we lost almost all of the literature from this incredible initial first Christian tradition, the Nazarenes. And we have just little scraps and morsels surviving, but even the little morsels we have tell an explosively different story than the one we've been given.
Inspired souls, lumen beings, I wanted to take a moment to thank all of you that are subscribed to this podcast. Everything you see around here, guests like Aaron Abke coming to the podcast, is powered and empowered by your subscription to this channel. Thank you so much for your incredible love and support. And to all of you that haven't yet subscribed, please do take a moment. And in fact, some of you think you are subscribed, but you're actually not. So check it out. There's a subscribe button below. So take a look at that subscribe button. And if it's visible, that means you haven't yet subscribed. Please do hit that subscribe button, hit the bell notification icon, and join the community, join the movement, spreading love, positivity, and wisdom like this around the planet together. Thank you so much for your incredible love and support. And talking about support, we can dive in even deeper if you're willing in the Inspired Circle. Join us in community. We gather together weekly to meditate, community sharings, sharing circles, community offerings, Reiki, healings. There's lots of cool stuff going on in there. And once a month, you get to sit down with guests such as Aaron and talk to them directly, ask your questions. It's an incredible experience, even if I can say so myself, to be asking your questions directly of the guests. It's a phenomenal opportunity. So please do join us inside the circle. I'll put a link in the description below. inspiredevolution.com/circle, link in the description below. We'd love to have you on the inside. Interestingly, you mentioned the enlightened DNA within, that lineage. Do you think there are descendants of Christ alive today?
If I had to bet, I think Jesus probably did have a child. There's really good evidence for this actually in something that a good friend of mine, Dr. James Tabor, was part of a discovery called the Talpiot Tomb. And it was a big documentary they released in like 2010 or somewhere around there. I think it was 2006 when they discovered it. But essentially, in Israel, they were building apartment buildings somewhere, and the foundation broke and collapsed into this underground cave system. And it's very common that Jews in early centuries in ancient Judaism would bury people in caves and bone ossuaries and stuff like that. So there's lots of that you'll run into when excavating in Israel. And they go look around, they call some archaeologists, go, I think we found a grave, let's check it out. And they're pretty stunned because it's all the bone boxes in the ossuary are written as the exact names of Jesus's family and his brothers as listed in the Gospels. And it says, it has one of Yeshua ben Yosef, Jesus son of Joseph, Mary of Magdala, And then their child, I can't remember the child's name, but I want to say it was Joshua or Jacob, something like that, with a J. And then it lists Jesus's brothers. There's one missing, and it's the ossuary of James, his brother. And interestingly, there has been an ossuary of James floating around the antiquities market for a while, and many scholars have looked at it and studied it and tried to find out if it's legitimate. And it seems like it is, but nobody can track down its origins, right? So Dr. Tabor and his group had the idea of let's test the like molecular DNA of the bacteria growing on the side of because there was a bunch of like fossilized bacteria or whatever on the side of the ossuary because it's very, very old. It was clearly in a cave for many centuries. And then we'll cross-test that with the Talpiot tomb cave and see if it matches, because apparently bacteria, they always will match in the same area. And if you move too far, the bacteria DNA is different. So there's no question whatsoever. If it matches, it came from the same location. And they cross-referenced it, and sure enough, perfect match. And so that's where James's ossuary was. Some grave robber removed it to go sell it on the market. But in any case, there's little bone fragments in them, and they did DNA test some of the bone fragments and found some really remarkable things, like I think it was like Semitic DNA from the first century, like they carbon dated and stuff. So everything was kind of honing in on this is a legitimate first century bone box with all these names of the Jesus family. And right when they were really like making ground on it, the Jewish authorities came and said, hey, we're shutting this thing down. It's against Jewish custom to dig up a grave. And so you're violating the Torah essentially. And they covered over the grave and they sealed it and built apartments over it. So no one's allowed to investigate it anymore. It's so tragic, dude. There was so much more evidence to go through, but that's just a little snippet of it. And again, that tomb showed that if this was the legitimate family tomb of the Jesus dynasty, it shows that they did have a child, Mary and Jesus.
Whoa. Okay.
Just drop that heater on you.
So that implies that the narrative between Mary and Jesus is very different then as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's early fragments of, or little fragments of texts like the Gospel of Jesus' wife, which talks about Jesus, Mary being Jesus' wife. And Christianity does the same thing with basically anything outside of the canonical New Testament, is they say, oh, it's just like a Gnostic forgery from the 3rd century. But the problem with that is that the New Testament is chock full of known forgeries from the 2nd century. So they have nothing better on textual tradition really than the Gnostics do. Scholars study these things because like, hey, we don't care what's considered orthodox or heterodox. We care what the earliest attestations say about Jesus. Even if they're conflicting, we want to know the truth and the history. And so scholars study these Gnostic texts found at the Nag Hammadi and so forth, and some that have been found around in other dig sites and stuff. And they just say, what were people saying about Jesus and his family and so forth in the earliest attestations we have? And in some of them, like the Gospel of Jesus' wife, and I think the Gospel of Mary, they're clearly husband and wife. And I've always found it curious, bro, reading the New Testament, the canonical Gospels, and like Mary's in every single scene. Mary's the only disciple who actually came to Jesus' crucifixion. All the men tucked tail and abandoned him. And yet there's Mary, and then Mary, Jesus' mother, and then I think one of Jesus' brothers in one of the Gospels. So Mary's there at the tomb as when Jesus resurrects. She's I think in Mark, she's the first one to see the empty tomb. So it's like, why was this woman hanging around Jesus like so much? In the 1st century, she's not Jesus' wife. I think people would have at least suspected that she was and asked questions. But if she was so open about always being with Jesus at every meeting, every event, post-death, pre-death, like she probably was his wife, right? And if you're going to sell this idea that Jesus was born of a virgin and was himself a virgin and never sexually tainted and all this crap, then you have to get her out of there as fast as possible and obfuscate her. And one of the ways they did that was by making her the whore that Jesus saves in John chapter 8, which is also interesting because there's a number of known interpolations in the New Testament, meaning passages that were added in much later, and we have manuscript evidence to prove this. So the earliest copies of the Gospel of John do not have the story of the woman caught in adultery, which is kind of a huge bummer, to be honest, because I love that passage. It's one of the best Jesus passages, one of the most famous, right? Let he who's without sin cast the first stone. And it was added in like in the 3rd century. There's there's some evidence that the very first gospel written in Hebrew, called the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, had a passage like this in it that one of the church fathers writes about, that Jesus saves a woman from persecution. So it might actually go back to a real story, which is cool. But the ultimate point I'm getting at is that Christianity said, oh, that woman who was caught in adultery, that was Mary. Yeah, Mary was a whore that Jesus saved. So can you imagine Jesus marrying a whore? It's a very staunchy religious way of obfuscating the truth, right? No Christian is going to want to believe that Jesus married a whore. And the fact is, Mary wasn't a whore. She was probably a very dignified woman from a very wealthy family. Dr. Tabor talks a lot about this in his book, The Jesus Dynasty. She was probably a very high-level, respectable woman, and I think she probably was leading or involved in a lot of the mystical arts in the Nazarene Christian, ceremonies and temple meetings that they were having. I think that Mary probably did delve into a lot of the more white magic type things, like thought creating reality and teaching these kinds of principles, the psychic principles. I can see that being legitimate, but there's no question in my mind that there's more to the story than we've been told by Christianity with Jesus and Mary. And if you get rid of all the stuff we know is bullshit, like the virgin birth and so forth, then it makes no sense to posit that she wasn't somehow romantically involved with Yeshua.
It's really interesting at this juncture in the conversation. I can't help but reflect on the Ramayana. And there's this story of Ram, and then there's a story of Raman, and then Sita is, taken from Ram and then taken to...
the Ramayana.
Yeah, the Ramayana.
I love it,
and
man.
The interesting thing there is, at face value, for most people, the story of the Ramayana is about Ram and Ravan, like the forces of good and evil, light and darkness. But actually, once you start to get into the metaphysical nature of things, actually, a lot of the story is actually about Sita. Right? It's actually about the feminine and the dance of the feminine. So interestingly here, I mean, you've got this very interesting, once again, like the layer of the feminine is not what meets you at the face value. Like they intentionally or like have gone out of their way to sort of erase this feminine aspect of some of this work. That's really something. Do you think that reflects on the time in terms of the patriarchy, or what do you think what do you think metaphysically that speaks to in terms of the feminine suppression there?
Yeah, of course, it speaks to that. And I think additionally, it speaks to a lot of Paul's theology. And this is a little bit tricky because only 7 of the 13 Pauline epistles in the New Testament were actually written by Paul, according to most scholars. This is the consensus, at least. 6 of them, and I've studied them pretty in depth in terms of their legitimacy. 6 of them are undoubtedly forgeries from the 2nd century that are put in Paul's name, so pseudepigraphical works. But it's more in the pseudepigraphical works of Paul that you get this very anti-feminine, misogynistic, patriarchal take. But Paul is quoted as saying, and so whoever forged First Timothy, for example, could have been pulling from other Pauline letters and quoting him directly or quoting what he believed and taught in other documents, because there were many more letters of Paul circulating at that time to many other churches that just didn't survive the test of history. We only have probably a very small sampling of his letters in total. And so this could be legitimately Paul, and it's quoted as being Paul, but we don't know for sure. But in 1 Timothy, this is one of the things that really drove me out of Christianity, was seeing the misogyny, where Paul is quoted as saying, if a woman wants to speak in church, she should cover her head first, for it's shameful for a woman to speak in church. And if a woman has a question about something, she should keep her mouth shut, essentially, and ask her husband at home, for it's shameful for a woman to speak in church. And there's even this idea of if a woman does speak in church, if she's prophesying or whatever, her husband must stand behind her as her covering. And then he even says, because we must remember, Eve ate the apple first and then deceived Adam to eat the apple. So they believed that the feminine was a deceptive type of role in the story of humanity, and it was to be underneath the masculine for protection, and we got to keep that feminine subdued. And there's some truth to the idea that women are much more psychic and psychically talented at mind tricks and manipulation. But I think that that's more of a product of the patriarchy. I really do. I think that because women are the physically inferior gender, if women are being dominated by men, what are they going to do? They're going to go to war with all the men? They're going to beat up all the men? No, they don't have that ability to do that. They have to find other means of gaining power back. And so women, I think, over the history of humanity have gotten just naturally by literally like nature's impulse to evolve and adapt with your environment. Women have gotten very intuitively intelligent with emotional understanding and awareness and therefore manipulation. And women had to learn how to psychologically manipulate men into doing things they wanted or not doing things they didn't want for their own good, for their own survival. And so it's very good that they developed that ability. But the church and religion has, historically weaponized that against the feminine to say, oh, women can't be trusted. They're too emotional. They're crazy. Da, da, da. So the men have to rule and lead. And so I think that patriarchal belief system about the feminine being somehow inherently dangerous or something, gender, is what has largely led to the covering up of Mary and Jesus clearly having had a sexual relationship with her and producing children like every other normal human being does. These are the things that I think make Jesus better and more inspiring, not less inspiring. I can't be inspired by a person that I can't relate to in any way. A person who never has a sexual experience or sexual temptation and just kind of walks on air, transcends all the ego's, blind spots and just ascends to heaven. Like, great for you, man. But I'm still trapped down here in the throes of third density and suffering and struggling. And I'm not doing everything perfect. I make mistakes and I learn from those mistakes and God uses them for my good. I want a Jesus like that. I want a Jesus who is a real person like you and I, who really grapples with the human experience and meets us down in the dirt, eyeball to eyeball, and says, I understand your temptation. I understand your pain. And the inspiring thing is that Jesus did experience all of that and was able to transcend it through his God consciousness and his devotion to God. And therefore, he set the model for all of us. He's the archetype. He is the blueprint of this is what is possible for a human being in a human lifetime. You can live fully from your heart, live fully from love, and be aware of that all-loving intelligence which surrounds us all at every moment. You don't have to live in blindness to that truth anymore because Jesus showed you the way how to do it. And then he taught you how to do it with his teachings, right? And so this is why part of our podcast, we stress that it is the teachings of Jesus that should matter the most, not our beliefs about him or the doctrines and creeds and theologies about him and his metaphysical nature. Those things are far, far secondary to his actual teachings and pointings to God. Because would any Christian deny that Jesus already showed us the perfect way to God and his teachings are that way? I think a Christian would have a hard time disagreeing with that statement. And yet their whole belief system is kind of predicated on disagreeing with it. None of that stuff can save you, Amrit. You can't go to heaven just by forgiving everyone and not judging. You can't go to heaven just by loving your neighbor as yourself. You're going to burn in hell, man, if you don't confess Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. And I really do think, Amrit, that's a message Jesus would find reprehensible if he were alive today and he found out what became of his teachings. I think he would tear his garment in half and say, this is blasphemy. This is not what I came to teach. I came to point to the one God, not to become the one God and be worshiped as a deity and pedestalized. I think it would make Jesus throw up in his mouth.
Can I get my bearings with you? So do you see there being metaphysically Christ consciousness and then Jesus being an embodiment of like an avatar embodiment, wholly and solely of Christ consciousness? And the reason I ask that question is because then is Mary Magdalene like a feminine portal to Christ consciousness? Can you help me orient myself here a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the stuff I like talking about the most. We actually just recorded a podcast called What is Christ Consciousness? It will be coming out next week on the Jesus Way. And what we explain is sort of that, like, what is the Christ? What does that mean? I know in John 1, right, it says, in the beginning was the Logos, the Word was with God. And Christians equivocate that to be Christ. In the beginning was Christ, right? And all things were made through him. And without him, not one thing was made or came into being without him. And so I find that to be very interesting, right? Because if that's true, then that passage in John 1 says that all things, all people, came into being through Christ. Wow, now that's a powerful statement, and one I can say, hallelujah, brother, amen. I agree. All beings come into being through Christ. So what is Christ? Christ to me is the divine idea of man in the mind of God, right? If we say God is perfect and omniscient, God knows everything, then you have to conclude that all of God's thoughts are in essence perfect. God is incapable of imperfection, being an all-perfect, all-intelligent being. So everything God does must be perfect in some way, in its own way. They're all different expressions of that perfection, which is infinite. And so if that's true, then you would have to, agree that God must have a perfect idea of man in God's mind, right? The archetype, the blueprint that we're all supposed to shoot for. And that is what the Christ represents. It's almost like a teleological man, the final cause, the final rendition of what man is meant to be or capable of being. And so when we call Jesus the Christ, metaphysically what we're saying is that the man Jesus is our best example or embodiment of the Christ principle, that the closest place we can go to look and learn and study what the Christ looks like in living demonstration is Jesus, Yeshua, the Nazarene. And so it's not actually a title of deity, because Yeshua was a real person like you and I. Otherwise, the Christ has no meaning at all if he's not like us. And so he was a man who realized this truth within himself, that God's perfect ideal of man, the most righteous, loving, perfect ideal is in me now, and I can actualize it by living according to God's law and communing with God daily and so forth. And he gradually, over a long lifetime of spiritual seeking, I think he definitely went to the East and studied all those traditions and came back later, but he learned how to embody it and live it, and he was obviously a very advanced soul as well. And the Law of One says that actually Yeshua's soul that incarnated chose the path of martyrdom because he wanted to go into this fallen world of the first century and act as a catalyst to change it, because it was so broken and lost with the temple sacrifice system, the temple cult running everything. And Jesus wanted to do something drastic to shake it up. And he said, I'll go give my life. And so Jesus did that. And I think it's worth considering that Jesus's true mission and purpose might have been very different than what religion has sold us. Because if you can't find anywhere in the mouth of Jesus, I'm going to die for your sins, blah, 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 then you say, well, then what was his real message or his purpose? And Jesus is preaching, right, about the kingdom of heaven coming now. It's already here and at hand, but we must live it and demonstrate it. So like right there, to me, Jesus is trying to be the model, which is the Christ, right?
And then Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, I think the fact that Mary was likely Jesus's partner, Yeshua the person, just like Yeshua kind of represents the Christ principle in that he embodied it the closest, we could also consider that the Shiva principle, right? The divine masculine. And then Mary would serve as the Shakti in the Christian tradition. And I think it is important to have those archetypes because the Eastern religions do this very well. And the monotheistic religions, the Abrahamic religions, they call it blasphemy and polytheism and stuff. But it's just the fact that the Eastern traditions have a way more sophisticated ontology than Christianity does. They understand the divine on a lot deeper level. And so they understand although we believe there's one God, of course, obviously, and they call that, Brahman or whatever, that God is infinite and expresses in infinite ways, intangible expressions in our lives. And so it's also good to name those and understand them as functions of the Creator and stuff. So you have all the gods and the goddesses of the Hindu tradition, none of which a true, genuine Hindu believes is like a real deity worthy of worship. They believe they're worshiping an aspect of the true deity, of Brahman. And everything revolves around, it's all archetypes of Brahman. So I think Christianity could do well to mimic that a bit in understanding. And I think the 12 disciples could serve as these archetypes. Many of the disciples have very distinct archetypes that they express. James the Just, first of all, I've mentioned him a bunch. You have Thomas, who is kind of the wisdom principle. He was considered Thomas the Wise, and the Gospel of Thomas is the most famous Gnostic text that is just like mind-blowing non-duality, like true spiritual genius. And if that went back to Thomas, then yeah, that nickname lives up to the hype. Like he really was a very wise disciple. And I could go through more, but like Mary, divine feminine, and then we can use other Christian figures and symbols to express some of these archetypes from a Christian perspective. And I think that would be something that could greatly enrich people's understanding of the Christian tradition as well.
Hey there, Inspired Souls. Spirituality is not something we just talk about here at the Inspired Evolution. It's something we live and breathe with our entire beings. Whether it's in your career, your life, the way you lead in the world, or your relationships, it's at the heart of the way we believe life should be lived. And so if you're feeling out of alignment, or you can feel that there's something more, or you're feeling like you're not thriving in life, touch wood, the way that you ought to be, then we've got guidance to take you even deeper. You've got support from me one-on-one, and you've also got a like-minded, like-hearted community masterminding, master-hearting together through guidance together. And you don't have to take my word for it. This is how people all over the world have transformed through guidance.
Everything just kind of fell into place, and now I'm on a path that I actually believe in and I'm excited about, because I feel like I'm becoming my best self.
Over those 2 years, I have done so much. I can't believe where I am now. I'm thrilled where I am now. Not only was he a coach, but he became a divine presence in my life.
You can show up to Amrit with all sorts of chaos in your life, and you leave feeling completely centered with some direction that is going to get you results. It's just magic. When you're in coaching with Amrit, you just flow with it all.
I feel that I have access and connection to somebody who is deeply entrenched in my development.
If you're thinking about it, just do it. You won't regret it.
So what are you waiting for? If you feel the call, then join me on a call. amritsandhu.com/call. Link on screen now, and also at the top of the description in the show notes below. Join me in a call. Let's dive in deep to your path, onwards, upwards, and inwards from here. I'm looking forward to seeing you in a call. Go on, I'll see you there. Talking about 12 positive archetypes in that realm, you recently have written a book called The 3 Beliefs of Ego, and there are some interesting archetypes in there. Can you talk us about the sort of shadow archetypes that you explore in that book?
Yeah, I would love to. The book is actually out next week, published next week, but you can get it on pre-order already. This is kind of the summation of all my main teachings, which I teach online, on YouTube, and in my courses in 40 University. And it really revolves around this understanding, which is called the 3 beliefs of ego. And on this topic of Jesus, the last chapter of the book is titled Jesus and the 3 Beliefs. And I go through the story of Jesus's temptation in the wilderness, the 40 days in the wilderness. And I pull out and I show how each one of the 3 temptations of Satan is a perfect representation of the 3 beliefs, like one by one, succinctly. And Jesus transcends them and overcomes them in kind of similar ways that I teach in the book. So I show the parallels. And so the basic, 3 belief structure is lack, attachment, and control. These are the 3 kind of turning points around which the ego revolves, and the kind of only 3 real functions that the ego has, and the only 3 ways we create separation from God in our mind, in our awareness. So we believe I am lacking first. When I come into a body and I undergo the veil of forgetting and all of that, I have no memory of my soul, my past lives, the universe, anything. Then the ego is kind of born out of that ignorance, and it's like a survival adaptation of the mind of let me create an identity so that I can know myself and what I am and where I come from and stuff. So it wants to create an identity because it comes into this life without an identity. So it's a protection mechanism. So it's very good and noble in that regards. But as soon as you believe I am truly a separate, isolated character in the universe, like there's me and then there's the universe. And I don't know if the universe is actually all that kind. In fact, it might be kind of cruel and dangerous and scary. And you're now believing that you are actually separate from the womb in which you exist, right? Which is the universe. And so once you believe you're separate, these 3 beliefs flow right out of that belief that I'm a separate self. And the first one is, if I'm separate, I must be lacking in some way. And all human beings come pre-installed, right, with these beliefs. But this is one of the biggest ones, is like, there's something in me that's just fundamentally missing. I'm incomplete. There's something not there that needs to be there. And we don't know what it is, but we go out in search of it through pleasure and chasing outcomes, right? And that's the second belief of ego, is attachment, which is like, my happiness depends on outcomes. My happiness is outside of me. I've got to go out into the world and find happiness in positive, pleasurable outcomes. And so I call it outcome happiness as well. It's the second belief. Happiness comes from outside. And that will lead to the third belief, which is the belief in personal agency, or we could even say the belief in free will to an extent. And when I say free will, I want to be clear what I mean. I mean like total and complete autonomous free will in every way. The ego really believes that it has such a thing and that there are really no limitations on it or something. and it acts and behaves as if that were true when it's very clearly not true. The person, the ego, is not in control of life. The person is a product of life. Life is living through the person. Life is the greater power, not the person. And there's nothing a person can do to fight reality and resist and make things happen in my favor other than the way the universe wills it to be. And so we live under this mistaken assumption that I'm really the one controlling how my life goes, and I can make good things happen and I can avoid bad things from happening. And it's like, we live under that belief for a long time, and it continually fails to prove itself, right? No matter how much I try to avoid bad outcomes and suffering, they continually come my way, And no matter how hard I chase the things I want, it just seems like I never really get it. It's always eluding me, right? So we have to come to this recognition at some point that I'm not in control of life or the universe. I'm in cooperation with life in the universe. I'm co-creating with life. I'm part of it all. I'm connected to it all. And so that's how you would kind of transcend that third belief. So lack, attachment, control are the three beliefs. And I'll finish by showing you the three parallels. In the story of the 40 days in the wilderness, the first temptation of Satan is, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread to satiate your hunger. And so the devil there is asking Jesus to prove he's not lacking, right? You've been out here for a long time, Jesus, going on 30 days. Seems like you're pretty hungry. You look pretty emaciated. Prove that you're not actually starving. Make these stones bread. And Jesus responds by saying, man does not live by physical bread alone, but by the bread of God, right? And so he appeals to the higher dimension to transcend the temptation. The next temptation, Satan takes him to the top of the temple, I believe, top of a mountain, and he shows him all the surveying landscape of Jerusalem, I think, and says, if you worship and serve me, all this kingdom will be yours. I'll give it to all of it, riches, wealth, fame, women, you can have it all if you worship me. So there's the second belief, right? Outcome happiness. Happiness is outside of me. And wow, look at all the happiness in that kingdom. And Jesus says, I'm totally blanking on what Jesus says now, actually, but I hate when that happens. But Jesus similarly quotes scripture to transcend it. It'll come to me as soon as I finish talking about this.
You're good.
And then the third temptation is when he takes him to the top of the temple, and he tempts Jesus to throw himself off the temple and says, if you are the Son of God, then prove it by throwing yourself off the temple and saving yourself. Because doesn't the scripture say that he'll take his angels' charge concerning you? And Jesus says, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. And so again, he appeals to the higher truth. And that third temptation there, rather, is a perfect example of the belief in control. Like, prove that you can control and save your own life, that you have the power to save yourself. So it's pretty uncanny how the Bible even documents these kind of three principal or archetypal beliefs that all human beings grapple with throughout our lives.
It's really nifty how those are some really deep stories and hidden there. But yeah, just the way you've articulated them through those three sort of mental vices, if you will, just makes it so clear and clean to be able to work with. Yeah, I really appreciate that. There's the 40 days in the wilderness. Man, we had the intention to discuss this at some point. At some point, Jesus, because in India there's this whole awareness around Isa, the Messiah. Yeah. And yet it doesn't seem to be widely sort of received that Jesus was in India. Jesus might have been in Egypt at some point in time. They call it the lost years of Jesus. What do you know about those lost years?
It's a very interesting topic. There's a really good book called Jesus in India, where a man whose name I'm forgetting, the author of the book, did almost like a whole lifetime's worth of research into this question by traveling to the East and searching into all these different regions and traditions that there's legends of Jesus being there, and tries to find the evidence that would corroborate that, and actually finds a stunning amount of it. But he mentions at the beginning what I think is the best piece of evidence from a Russian explorer named Nicholas Notovich, who wrote a book called The Hidden Life of Issa, I believe. And it's about the story of, he goes to a Tibetan monastery in China on a trip, and he talks to a lama who makes some kind of comment I'm forgetting, but about Jesus or that figure. And I think he asked him, do you guys have any legends of Issa coming here? And he says, yeah, actually we do. There's a scroll here somewhere here that documents the story of Isa coming to Tibet or whatever, to this monastery. And but he said, unfortunately, that we know we have like 80,000 manuscripts, so it would take us a very long time to dig it up for you. I'm very sorry. And he kind of walks away. And so Nicholas Notovich was bummed out, but he said, I'll cut my losses. And he heads back on his trip. And he's like not that far away from the monastery, which is kind of up in a mountainous region, that his horse like twisted, broke its ankle and fell over and like landed on his right femur and crushed his femur, broke it. And so he's in tremendous agony, right? And so the closest place is the monastery he just came from. So he turns around and goes back, and the monks come and they rush to greet him and help him into the monastery and all of that. And the head lama heard the news and was like, oh, that's so tragic. And he says, I have just the thing that'll cheer him up. And he commands or orders some of his monks to go dig through the library of scrolls for the hidden life of Issa. And so he was holed up there for a number of weeks, at least, before he could continue on his journey, waiting for his femur to heal. I can't remember exactly how long he was there, but eventually they found the scroll and they bring it in, and it's written in Tibetan language. And so they have a translator who's reading it to him in English. And he asked the translator, can I write this down as you read it out? Because I want to document this in English. And he says, sure. And so then he gives the full story as it was written in this Tibetan scroll. And the scroll dates, I think it claims to date to early 2nd century, something like that. But he writes it in his book, The Hidden Life of Issa. And if anyone's interested in knowing about what Jesus did in the missing years, you absolutely have to read it. Because to me, it just perfectly smacks of the Yeshua we know, of the kind of, brash, brazen, Pharisee-opposing rabbi preacher who's out in the streets calling out all the hypocrisy and reading everybody's mail, right? And stirring up all the crowds. Well, that's kind of what Issa does everywhere he goes in this text. He goes to he goes somewhere, Persia, I think, with the Zoroastrians and studies with them for a while. And he ends up finding all their hypocrisies and he calls them out for it. And it's essentially teaching like sun worship was something happening back then in Zoroastrianism in Persia. And he was like, why do you teach people to worship the sun as a god when it's the one God who makes the sun, go around in the sky? You should worship only the one God. And then his followers come to him that evening and say, yes, Issa, the priests are very unhappy with you and they're coming to kill you. So you should probably get out of here. And so he hightails it out and escapes just before he gets killed, like he does in the canonical Gospels a bunch, right? And then he goes to Tibet, he goes to India. He calls out the Brahmins in India for teaching idol worship, all the figurines they make, and they subjugate the lower class people to make these idols for cheap labor. And he's like, y'all a bunch of hypocrites, dude. None of this is real. And the Brahmins come to kill him and he bounces and goes somewhere else. So he ends up in Tibet for like 6 years. And you're like, yeah, that's exactly how I would expect Yeshua to behave if he had traveled to other worldly traditions and studied. Why would he give any preferential treatment like he didn't give his own people, his own Jewish people? Like he called out the hypocrisy very vehemently against his Jewish companions back in his hometown and all that. Why would he not do that abroad if he sees hypocrisy? And that's very much the theme of the text, is like he wasn't really welcome anywhere. And it makes you wonder if that's not what Jesus meant in the famous passage in the Synoptics where he says, birds have nests and foxes have holes for their dens, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. It's like, kind of sounds like a guy who's been kicked out of a lot of clubs, right?
Yeah, it's interesting when you're reflecting that. I can't help but reflect on Jesus seems like way more Aquarian in his energy than Piscean, which is actually the symbol of the fish that his followers ended up with.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
It's fascinating. I wanted to talk a little bit, if it's okay, and this is going to be a bit personal, so it's okay if you don't want to go there. But as you mentioned, Jesus there's this sort of rebellious for the truth, right? Is the energy that he's embodying.
Very much.
Just with the work and the way you're going about uncovering some of the stuff, the Jesus way, and the 3 beliefs of the ego, and just the work you've been championing, you've actually come up against theologians quite a bit. Do you find yourself ever worried for your well-being in any way? How are you navigating all of this?
Well, it hasn't come to that yet, thankfully.
Gotcha.
And I don't think it will, but yeah, it's not something I worry about in that regard. I actually see it as a really good sign because it obviously means that those people are very threatened by this message, or that they find it very threatening, which means they find it to be potentially very truthful, and that bothers them because that obviously implies they're in the less truthful, tradition of Christianity. So I get it, and those kinds of subconscious tells to me are actually like a big net positive. I would be worried if nobody was concerned with what I was teaching. It just comes with the territory. But the other big factor of it for me is I'm not trying to convert anyone, or like, I don't, if you're a hardline fundamentalist Christian, like, cool, if that works for you, great. I don't need to change your belief system. And I'm certainly not threatened by yours at all. So I have no need to like attack your beliefs and come on your page and write that you're a heretic and all that. But why does everybody do that to me? Why does everyone come on my page to attack my posts and call me heretic and blasphemer and all that? It's because the message is getting through. And so Jesus said, like, you're going to be persecuted for my sake. There's no getting around it. And, when I was in Christianity, when I was a Christian, I was never persecuted by anybody for being a Christian. No one had a problem with it. It wasn't a controversial road to take in life. And Jesus actually said that my way is like archetypally controversial. Like, it will always be controversial, is what he was trying to get across in any day and age. He said, I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword, meaning a division. He said, a mother and daughter will be separated in their own household. A father and a son will be separated in their own household. Like, what is he talking about there? Clearly, he's talking about the way that spiritual beliefs and ideologies can massively divide families from one another. And most Christian friends I had who left Christianity were disowned by their parents, for example, right? So Jesus was saying, like, this is going to bring a lot of conflicts in your life, and you will be persecuted. If you're really following my teachings, oh boy, they're coming for you. And I take that to heart. And I want to be somebody that is worthy of that persecution, who really bears that cross with humility and doesn't return hate for hate, but overcomes evil with good, as Jesus says, and can say, forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. And so for that reason, the kind of like onslaught of nonstop Christian persecution or whatever that I get has really become one of my staple spiritual practices that I utilize every day. Like, almost like the most important thing I can do today is overcome any resistance I have to this, any judgments I feel, any need to return and attack. Those, impressions and urges still arise in me sometimes, and I try to take full advantage of those opportunities. And I wouldn't be able to do this deep excavation of my soul and finding real unconditional love and forgiveness for all people, regardless of their beliefs, without this catalyst, right? Without all these people being my mirror every single day. And so I'm honestly very grateful for it, even though it proves challenging often. I think our souls came here to be challenged, not to have an easy, coast by on an easy ride. And so I just consider this like, clearly this is something my soul signed up for, to experience a lot of persecution for speaking the truth. And so, being a soul lesson, right? You got to step up to the plate and do your very best.
Wow. So what I'm hearing from you, it actually, in a weird way, brings you closer to Christ for yourself.
Without question, yeah. How can you relate to one of the most persecuted men who ever lived, if you aren't persecuted?
The interesting thing I just want to reflect back to you is the discourses online have been very, very interesting to watch and receive. And because it's theology, it's quite deep in terms of the grounds that you guys cover in these conversations that you have. But one of the big things that actually communicates volumes, beyond actually what's being discussed, because it can be difficult to track at times, the weeds of the narratives and the theology, is actually the embodiment of love and care as you're having these conversations. That piece, I just want to reflect back to you, means a lot. You may be aware of that, or you may not be aware of that as you're going through the dance that you're going through, but I just want to reflect that back to you. Not to put you on a pedestal, but just to sort of reflect that back to you, brother, that there's something really deep about what you're sharing, but also as you take this on, like you've just described, it's really profound to witness.
Wow, thank you, man. That's a very beautiful compliment. And I would love to say something about that, actually.
Please.
Because that does come up pretty often from people in the comments or whatever who say, you know what I love about you guys and this podcast is you guys really embody these teachings. And even before I started the Jesus Way on, all my YouTube videos, this common thing I hear is like, I love Aaron because he's so embodied in the teachings. And as much as I am grateful for that reflection and very much, want that to be the truth, like my question is always, how could you possibly know that? Like how do they all think they know that I'm so embodied? It must just be a kind of quality that comes through in the teachings themselves or something, but it's certainly not something I can like pick up or register, because as somebody who, this is true for anybody, right, who is so committed to their spiritual growth and their walk with God, that you can almost overdo the self-examination and be like, I'm always looking for my mistakes. It's the only thing I really have a radar for is mistakes. Because what's not a mistake, I go, great, you can pass through, you're fine, I don't need to worry about you. What's true is true. Let's go for what's false, what's unreal in my mind. And I'm always looking for my weaknesses and blind spots. And so I guess that would be like a critical, component of embodiment, obviously. But it saddens me sometimes, to be honest with you, man, because I want to be able to see myself the way others see me, because I think there's something important to that. Not to the extent it goes to your head and your ego or whatever, but to genuinely see like the gifts and the expression that I carry that people love so much would, I think, just help so much with self-love and authenticity and owning who I am more. And so I'm excited as time goes forward to continually try to expand in that area, because I think we all do this to ourselves on the spiritual path. We get so hyper focused on our mistakes that we can't really see our light anymore. Even though it's there, we can't see it. And there is something important about seeing your light in terms of embodiment.
Inspired souls, lumen beings, what are you taking away from today's podcast? This is such an incredible conversation with Aaron. We're covering so much ground. Mary Magdalene, Jesus' lost years, the time in the wilderness, the 3 beliefs, and my goodness, Aaron is such a gift. Thank you so much for tuning into this podcast. And I would like to invite you to join in on the conversation. I learned so much from the questions you guys ask in the comments below. It's an incredibly enriching experience, and some of the best conversations I've ever had are actually in the comments of the YouTube section below. So let me know, what are you taking away from today's conversation? What sparks your curiosity the deepest? I'd love to hear from you. Join in on the conversation in the comments below. Yeah, and I think that's really profound, because I think that's why we are like a communal, even back to what you said, Jesus, like, the communal living, right? Like give up what you got and come in, shared abundance, right? And I think that's why we're all meant to be mirrors of each other, or meant to have tribe and collective like this. Just one thing I'll further add, just to sort of add to the reflection there, is I think just the dynamics of, saying how do people see that? I think when the conversation's happening, and someone's leaning in, you're ending up more and more centered onto your truth, which then gives you like even more efficacy in what you're saying at the times. Whereas the forces that are sort of having that conversation with you end up feeling like they're more and more off their center and becoming more and more volatile.
Great point. Yeah.
Right? And so and all of a sudden it's like there's pressure from both sides, but one side is, as it's retreating, it's sort of becoming more solid, whereas the other one's becoming more windy and blazy, and it's like, and that's just what you can feel energetically when you're hearing these discourses happen, and the volatility doesn't feel centered, and that centeredness in, what we would examine to be the truth is still an exploration, right? Feels embodied.
Yeah. That's a great reflection. I think you're very much right about kind of the metaphysics of how that happens and how we pick up on these things at an intuitive level, not really a conscious level. I think it probably also has to do with like what a teacher emphasizes most. And to me, that's why I look to Yeshua as the ideal, because it's like, look, I love non-duality. I love a good metaphysical concept, but I really don't grow spiritually unless I love my neighbor as myself. Like at the end of the day, what really reaps the rewards on the spiritual path is all the stuff Jesus said. Judge and you'll be judged. Forgive and you'll be forgiven. The measure you give is the measure you get back. So love your neighbor as yourself. Like if you can just do that, to me, you're a true spiritual master. Even if you suck at explaining non-duality, like you're leagues beyond the person who's up on a stool teaching an audience high-level concepts. Maybe and I've learned this from experience, that person may be totally unembodied. And if people knew what that person, how they live in their normal life, I don't even mean they're like doing all these scandalous things necessarily, although that does happen. I just mean like to watch all the ways that their ego gets easily triggered throughout the day at like little stuff that I consider to be not that advanced on the spiritual path, like being super defensive all the time. It's like, if you're teaching non-duality, you should definitely be past that phase, right? Otherwise, in my opinion, you really have no business teaching people the stuff you don't know through your own embodied wisdom yet. You have to live this stuff to really get it, and therefore to really teach it effectively. And so a lot of spiritual philosophies get taught in a very irresponsible way, in my opinion, especially like non-duality. And I would throw law of attraction in there too, in a lot of ways. If you create such a huge focus on the high esoteric, sexy stuff, and you overlook the grounded human aspect, embodiment level stuff like kindness and forgiveness and humility and all of that, then you're not walking a real spiritual path, in my opinion. And I'm speaking this as somebody who walked that way for a long time. I really thought it was about reaching for the knowledge. And going back to Jesus after having my ass handed to me by life for many years in many tough catalysts, I started to realize, you know what? I know all these amazing concepts and I can teach them pretty good. And none of them are saving me from these experiences. Like, I have to learn my life lessons. I have to just get present and see what part of my pride is this experience asking me to overcome. And then I got to do what Jesus said and deny myself and take up my cross to follow him. I have to stop feeding my ego in its selfish patterns. And that's what all of Jesus's ministry was about and focused on. And so that's what is the real cutting edge stuff to me. And I think people that live that and embody that, there has to be an energy they carry. And typically, I think when someone's really embodied in spiritual truth and virtue, they have a kind of calm groundedness, right, about the way that they teach. They don't come off like a snake oil salesman or whatever, trying to sell you something with a lot of hype and inflammatory, excitatory type ways of teaching. Not that that always means somebody's not embodied, but it tends to be the way that spiritual egos like to teach, is they like to sell the sexy thing and kind of often promise it to be some kind of salvation, like this teaching is going to change everything. And what I found is by chasing these teachings that change everything, even in non-duality, if I can do all those things, but I can't love my neighbor as myself, my suffering endures, period. Like, it really is all about the golden rule. It is the highest and most advanced spiritual concept there is, to love your neighbor as yourself. In that concept, I agree with Yeshua. It really does define the entire law, which I consider the law of one, the law of the universe, which is the law of oneness. Do no harm. What you do to another must be done unto you, because you cannot imbalance the universe. And so the imbalance, when you violate someone else's free will, that consequence has to fall upon the violator, not the universe. So when we understand this, we realize like there is almost no reason to study or practice anything else until I at least have a somewhat good handle on this golden rule. I'm almost kind of wasting my time in any other area.
Can you then help me try and understand what happened in the Crusades? What were the Crusades? And yeah, they don't seem very aligned to these teachings.
Yeah. Well, I think I almost brought up Constantine in the beginning of this podcast when we talked about the Roman Empire. In 311 AD, Constantine has this famous vision. And it's so funny to me, man. It's like, you just can't frickin' trust people who have private visions, dude. Like, all the people that get private visions end up being charlatans, man. Like Joseph Smith, David Koresh. I'll skip this next one for the sake of brevity. Paul, obviously, Constantine. These people that claim to have private visions always end up being charlatans. And so Constantine has this famous vision that he sees the sign of the cross in the sky. I think he's like in a military battle scene or whatever. And he sees the cross and he hears a voice, purportedly God's voice, and says, "By this sign, conquer." And so Constantine famously made the cross, the painted cross over the shield of the Roman Empire, as the kind of token military symbol that they would fly their banners under. And they believed that by wielding the power of the cross, they would have favor over their enemies, right? And so they literally turned Jesus into a battle instrument or something. And they justified the Crusades and all the holy wars and all the inquisitions and all the burnings and everything under this guise that if you don't believe what we believe, you are denying Jesus, you're a heretic whom Jesus, will cast from his presence, and you're going to go to hell forever. So it's like, if all these Islamic infidels and Jewish infidels are going to go to hell already anyways, what sin is it really to put them there a little bit sooner? And this is kind of the thought system of the ancient Christian world, right? In terms of justifying war. And Jesus being a, ardent pacifist who taught enemy love and infinite forgiveness and turning the other cheek and rebukes Peter for using the sword, is then turned into the greatest military instrument ever. It's like such a laughable joke that this tradition in any way whatsoever truly represents Yeshua. And I think that this is why the Roman Catholic Church had to opt for Paul's theology of salvation by faith alone, apart from works, because you can't make a military under Jesus's ideology. You can't raise an army with the banner of love your enemies. Love your enemies doesn't make for very good war cry, right? You need Paul's theology, which gives you a dividing line between the in and the out, the orthodox and the heretic. And if you don't believe in Jesus, you're on that side of the fence. And so now we're pretty much justified in doing whatever we want to you.
Yeah, as you're saying, war cries definitely does not beat a drum when you're playing a flute. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Doesn't fit the vibe, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just historically, so many times, the energy of Christ or the message of Christ being co-opted for personal interest, personal gain. Do you ever look at it metaphysically in terms of, what is really going on there? Why would something that is so true, so pure, be so readily co-opted time and time again?
I think, man, that this topic is so important for us to understand, because this is where humanity has utterly failed in every religious tradition in history, of totally misunderstanding, whether you want to call it Satan, the dark powers, I call it the negative polarity, evil, whatever term, pick your term. Humanity has totally misunderstood how the negative polarity operates and what rule sets they operate by. But that's why I love the law of one, because it explains the metaphysics of polarity extremely well. And it shows this obvious contrast, like yin and yang. The positive and the negative polarities are opposites. And by the way, the very first known Christian teaching, it's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's in the oldest Jewish Christian text called the Didache. It's in the New Testament under Jesus and James. It was called the two ways. And you'll know it famously from Jesus saying, narrow is the way that leads to life, and there are few that find it. But wide is the road that leads to death, and there are many who find it. There's the narrow road of life, the broad road of death, the two ways. And it says there's two ways a man can choose, the way of life or the way of death. And there is a great difference between these two ways. And they're describing, of course, the polarities, right? The positive polarity represents the way of life because it's about oneness and the interconnectivity of everything. And the negative polarity is the way of death because it's all predicated on separation and conquering and power over. So we project our own thought system onto the demonic very commonly. And we think that they think like us, they reason like us. And if I was a demon, here's how I would do it. If I was the devil, here's how I would, trick humanity. And so Christians have notoriously made this mistake of believing that the Bible has never been corrupted, there's no interpolations, there's nothing erroneous in here because God would never let that happen. And I find that to be a difficult idea to swallow, because then we could ask that same question about any disaster or horrible thing in history of why did God let that happen but doesn't let the Bible get changed? How does God pick and choose where to interfere with free will? Seems to me like God fully has his hands, behind his back in terms of not interfering with human free will. It's like, I gave you guys free will, use it as you please. But there is a rule set you have to follow if you want to enter this kingdom after your life, right? That's the universe we live in. So what would be the first thing a negatively polarized entity, a demon, whatever, would want to do if a true, godly, righteous message from the way of life, the positive polarity, gets transmitted through a holy person like Yeshua, or any of the prophets, or any holy person, Moses, you name it? Well, obviously, they're going to try to distort that teaching as fast as possible because they can't afford to lose power over the planet. They control all the people on the planet living under this ego consciousness, right? Of believing in war, believing in tribalism and separation and judging their neighbor and hating people and being sick and diseased. This is what feeds Satan, the negative polarity. And so they want to keep humanity subjugated, sick, unhealthy, poor, unhappy, at war, fighting each other. And so if you have this strong unifying message of light that comes through a holy person, a bright light attracts attention in the dark, right? And so you're going to get a whole lot of demons like moths to a flame running to that light to try to put it out. And so the way that the evil powers do this is not like humans expect, especially Christians, right? They think that if the devil were to try to interfere with the word of God, the Bible, that he would do it in some kind of obvious way, that they would spot from a mile away. The devil's just this obvious villain, right? Who has a twirling mustache and cackles when he approaches. He's easy to recognize villain. It's like, no, even the Bible says the devil comes clothed as an angel of light. And so this is why you get these contradicting beliefs about God. Like, yes, God did command that genocide in the Old Testament. Amalekites, slay the women, the children. Yep, that was God. That was really God. And then, God changed his mind later when Jesus came around and Jesus said, love your enemies, bless those who persecute you, do no harm to anyone. That's also the same God. It's because those ancient scriptures were distorted, right? The negative polarity got their hands on, the minds of the scribes or whatever it was to influence this belief system that God needs blood sacrifices, God is wrathful and angry, God commands war and genocide. And in some of our earliest Jewish Christian texts from the Nazarenes, the Clementine writings, they have this amazing section that's quoted as being from Peter that's attacking this idea that God would command war and peace at the same time, that God has like a split mind. And Peter says, if God commands war, then who commands peace? If God is in favor of death, who then is in favor of life? And he goes on this tirade like this and just explaining the ludicrous nature of it, that we believe that God has a split mind, is two-faced, right? Commanding death at some times and life at other times. And the Jewish Christian Nazarenes rejected this and said, no, God is love. God is eternal law that cannot be changed. So God cannot change his mind. I, the Lord, do not change, Isaiah 45:5. God cannot change his mind for any reason. God cannot lose power over the universe. The devil isn't fighting against God and beating up on God and sucking God's children to hell. God has no enemy that opposes God. And these are the axioms by which we must know the Creator. Otherwise, the negative polarity will just weave in like 10% evil into that 90% of truth. They'll give you 90% truth. So you go, oh yeah, I recognize these truths. Yeah, good. And then at the end of it, they'll say, and sacrifice a goat on the altar. Slit its throat, let its blood drain out. Yep. And you're like, well, all the other stuff was right, so that must be God. It's tricky.
Yeah, that is that is tricky. That tricky is the right word to put in there.
Tricky devil, huh?
What do you see the way forward, I guess, from here? Like, because I think it is apparent that it's like you're having this conversation. You've got some beautiful people that you interview on the Jesus Way podcast, also illuminating different parts of wisdom and insight for the Jesus Way. This information is now coming more and more to light. What do you think is happening metaphysically now as a time that we're sort of shifting into this place where we're actually got a greater appetite for this type of truth? Yeah.
I honestly believe that it's the second coming of Christ. I believe that that archetype refers to what's happening now. That for 2,000 years, the true teachings of Jesus, although they're still here in the red letters all along, right, in the canonical Gospels, they're still pretty well preserved, even in the totally corrupted Bible we have today. But how have we forgotten them? How have we overlooked them? How have we not lived by them for 2,000 years? And it's because of religion and institutional power. And so we're coming to a time now with social media, the internet, and AI. People have way less reason to outsource their power because they can learn anything they want to know online. Quick ChatGPT search will pull up just about anything. And so they don't need to be told what to believe anymore as much. And a lot of what they're told to believe, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance around it. I know that from personal experience. And every single non-Christian, ex-Christian I've ever talked to has also attested, yeah, I had a ton of internal conflict about certain ideas I could never really reconcile. And now that we have the age of social media, we're seeing all these Christian and non-Christian, atheist, Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, Muslim belief systems colliding on the internet and doing reactions to each other and debunking each other and doing live debates over and over and over every day, because we never really had this container before, right? Before the internet, and especially social media, united us so intimately with each other all around the world. Everyone kind of lived in their own little island. The Muslims, the Middle East kind of keep to themselves, the Christians in the West, the Catholics in Europe, and so on and so forth. And now you don't get the luxury of staying in a bubble world anymore. The bubble's been popped. And now you're going to confront all the other belief systems that you easily casted away as, oh, that's obviously wrong and heretical. I don't even need to look into that. And now those people are in your face saying that you're the heretic, that you believe wrong things. And I'm watching all these Christian, again, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, duking it out on the internet in like these rage fire debates, calling each other all kinds of names, being very un-Christ-like to each other because they're trying to prove which Christian tradition is the real one. And what's funny to myself and my colleagues at the Jesus Way podcast, Cam Waters and James, and some of the scholars we've had on, Dr. Tabor and so forth, what's funny to us is that it's like all of your traditions are totally fake. Like, there's no defending these traditions. There is no actual record or history of Peter ever going to Rome, starting a church, nor Paul. All the earliest records of the Roman church do not mention Peter or Paul. And in fact, Paul writes a letter to the Romans. Famously, one of his epistles that he did write, one of the 7, is to the Romans. And he's not the founder of their church. He's very much an outsider who's trying to get his way in, and he's trying to convince the Romans of his theology. And he's selling his theology to them and beckoning them to believe him. And that's why Romans is like the longest and best letter Paul wrote in terms of like laying out his belief system. He's trying to persuade these people. So it's like there was already a Christian church at Rome before Paul got there. And there's no evidence at all to corroborate this. But we have, on the other side of the fence, we have like unbelievable wealth of both secular and religious attestation of the first church and Christians being Nazarenes. So it's just kind of a funny situation we're in today that all the truths are coming to light, man. It really is an awakening that's happening, almost like an Akashic records unlocking. And now the floodgates have been opened and all the truth that's been covered up is coming to light. And I think that that's what the second coming has to really mean, is kind of the awakening, the discovery of the real message of Jesus. This man we all say was a true saint sent from God, is very different than what religion has told us. And if we can all understand that way, which is very simple and straightforward, we can begin living it and following it together. These are universal axioms that, again, all cultures would agree to. Do no harm, love your neighbor as yourself, forgive people. And to me, it really does represent a chance for humanity to find unity. Because again, every religious tradition I've studied, Islam, even Judaism, a lot of Jews I've spoken to have very high respect for Yeshua, but they don't believe he was literally God, is the difference, right? And of course, the Eastern religions, Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism, love Jesus. So I think it's the second coming, man. I think that Jesus is coming back in the sense of a return to his way and his message. And if each one of us could just play a small part in that by living that way and walking it ourselves and sharing it with others, I think we will expedite this awakening that's happening right now.
It's beautiful to hear you say that. Hey there, Inspired family. Aaron is joining us inside the Inspired Evolution Circle on October 5th. So join us, come along and ask your questions directly of Aaron. What is today's conversation inspiring within you? And what are your questions? And directly live together on Zoom, I step out of the way and you as the audience get to speak and interact directly with the guests. New guests every single month. October 5th, Aaron's going to be in there. So come on, join us. And also on the side, once a week, I guide meditations. There's community sharing circles. There's lots of cool stuff. It's very live, very interactive, a really cool space. And come meet Aaron. He's awesome. You're going to love it. I'll see you there. Yeah, I think, but watching people duke out, religion online and, having these sort of loggerheads is actually one of the factors, I want to say the only, but like one of the factors that many people are sort of, they look at people doing this and not loving thy neighbor in many ways in this pursuit of my truth is holier than thou. And it sort of, I don't want to say alienates them from religion, but sort of doesn't even push them away. I've found more and more people that I speak to do believe in their religion, but they've got their own current to their own religion in some way.
Yeah.
And they sort of, they've left like 90% of their religion not behind, but they're sort of like, I'm not sure about all of that, but everybody seems to be fighting about all of that. But it does give me my connection to my center and my Lord or my Christ or my God or my Allah or, my guru or whatever, and they've found their own little sort of corner within their own space that makes them whole. And I think more and more people are embodying this, I'm spiritual, but not necessarily religious space,
Right.
because of how much people in the religious space that are prophesizing themselves to be like so religious, understandably so, just watching the sort of, the duking out nature of all of that just feels so alien to, again, back to that embodied, actually what the teachings of spirituality actually mean to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is actually a great finishing note for this conversation. I think that maybe the main problem I haven't mentioned with Christian theology is that, again, they teach Paul's message of salvation by grace through faith alone, right? Apart from works. And Paul very much bangs on, by works, no one can be saved. And the problem with that is that Jesus is quoted 5 times in the New Testament as directly saying, you will be judged according to your works. I will judge every man according to his works, and by your works you shall be judged. And it goes right in line with everything else he said, right? I don't know who you are if you didn't love the least of these. And so it's once or twice in Matthew, once in Matthew, twice in John, and 3 times in the book of Revelations. Jesus explicitly says this, right? So this was the earliest record of what Jesus actually taught, is you are saved by works. And what I love about that is one of my other passion subjects to study is near-death experiences. When I left Christianity and came out of, you already know where I'm going with this. When I left Christianity, I was like, oh no, like maybe there's just no God and atheists are right. And I went through that kind of closet atheist phase and was very terrified because I didn't want there to not be a God. That was my whole life. But I didn't want to be fooled again. I didn't want to be lied to again. And so I said, if I'm going to believe in God, it's going to be because I have really good reasons in reality itself for believing so. I want reality to show me that God is real. And for that reason, I dove into near-death experiences because I thought, hey, if anybody knows what's the truth about life and what happens after we die, it's got to be people who've really died and come back to talk about it. And I had heard some NDEs as a Christian. We would play Christian NDEs sometimes. And I never saw the ironic truth behind them is that none of them ever say, no Christian ever says when they die and come back that they were judged by if they confessed Jesus as their Lord and Savior or not. That's never even part of the equation. It's always, I watched my whole life back. Whether you're atheist, whether you're Buddhist, Islamic, Christian, Jewish, everybody has the same experience. You're going to watch your whole life back. You're going to see every choice you made. You're going to have to reckon with those choices, with your soul, and go, oh my gosh, I violated the laws of God. I harmed other people. I lived selfishly. And I can't stay here knowing that. So people famously, even though they're offered a chance to stay dead and be in heaven or go back into their body, they say, no part of me wanted to go back to the human experience again after experiencing this supernal heavenly state. But because of the mistakes I made of not loving my neighbor as myself, essentially, my conscience forced me back into my body. I can't end on this note. I can't end on a total failure. I want to live up to God's truth. I want to live up to the truth of love. And oftentimes it's Jesus, right, who's meeting people in these NDE experiences and showing them their life, taking them on a little tour of heaven, showing them their life, and then saying, do you want another chance to go back and love your neighbor as yourself? And oftentimes with tears in their eyes, they're looking at Yeshua and they're like, yes, Lord, thank you for one more chance to live your way. And Jesus is like, that's my gospel. Sends them right back into their body. And they come back with this profound motivation to live a life of loving devotion and service to others. Service to God and service to others becomes the number one thing for almost everybody who has an NDE, is they realize I was not a good person. And life is all about being a good person. Essentially, NDEs, the millions and millions of recorded NDEs now, there's always this kind of same message you get. The ultimate conclusion of all NDEs is the universe is essentially a big morality test. It's really like a big test of your soul's conscience and your sensitivity to truth and therefore God, and how much you can live and embody that truth. And if you can't, you're going to want to come back for another lifetime, another shot at it, because your soul, being part of God, cannot be satisfied with the judgment and the selfishness and the ego that it lived with. The soul is pure and wants righteousness and truth and love and wants to live that truth. Who wants to practice a sport their whole life but never ever play under the big lights? You know, it'd be kind of a waste of one's time. You want to perform, right? You want to do it. You want to hit that home run. And that's how our souls feel. And that's why they come here. And so Jesus's soteriology of you are going to be judged by your works. And the funny thing is, you're the one who judges yourself by your works, right? The classic NDE is people say the source, the light, God, was completely non-judgmental. It had nothing for me but unconditional love. It was myself who I judged. I was the judge, and I couldn't live with myself when I saw my life back and knew all the people I'd harmed. I had to go make it right again. It's like you're judged by nobody but yourself. And isn't that exactly what Jesus said? Judge and you will be judged. Condemn and you will be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. And that's what other people say is when they look at the good times, the good moments in their life where they forgave and they humbled themselves, the soul has a kind of radiant joy at this seeing. It's this overwhelming feeling of fulfillment of, I did it. I really lived the truth of God in that way. And it's considered like the most fulfilling feeling they've ever had, you know? So right there is everything we're looking for in the Jesus way, in my opinion. It really is all about, can you love your neighbor as yourself? That's the ultimate test of the universe.
I was interviewing Jeffrey Olson on his near-death experience the other day, and he's got his minister vibes going on. And he was reflecting back to me that he saw this meme the other day, and you're at the pearly gates and you're sort of about to enter, and they're sitting at the front, whoever, take your pick, whoever's sitting, and they go, "Welcome. How was heaven?"
Oh, that's clever, man.
Aaron.
That's cheeky. I saw a good one too. It was a square image of a drawing, and it had the broad way, the wide road that leads to destruction at the end. And it was all these people, millions of people walking on it, and it said belief in Jesus. And then the other road was very narrow, and there was like 3 people on it leading to life, and it said following Jesus. I was like, that's it. That's the narrow way, man. It's to live this thing, not just say you believe it and go to church and talk about it, to really live it. I mean, that really is the narrow way, if anything is. How many people do you know strive to embody the teachings of Jesus as much as they ardently preach them to people? Very, very few people actually live that way. And the people who are living that way typically aren't the ones who are preaching and proselytizing to everyone and convincing them of how holy you are because of your beliefs. Those people get what it's all about, so they keep quiet. And they just try to live their life and be as righteous as they can, knowing that that's really the best teaching that there is.
Aaron Abke. Brother, it is always such an honor and a pleasure to have you here on this podcast, gracing us. I mean, yeah, I thank you for you. Thank you for your time and energy today, but thank you for you, man. Really appreciate you. And just, I hold you in these episodes are really, really dear. Every time you come on, the audience absolutely loves having you on as well. And it means a lot to me to be able to share in these conversations with you. So thank you so much for who you are, the work you do. Link to the new book, link to the new podcast, everything in the descriptions below for people to tune in a little bit deeper from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, brother.
Inspired soul living beings, you've made it through to the end of another incredible episode. Thank you so much for your inspirations to evolve. It is such an honor to be your brother walking this path by your side. You've obviously enjoyed this video, so please do give it a thumbs up and a like. It puts a vote of confidence for content like this online. So thank you so much in advance for your support. And while we're talking about support, my goodness, thank you to all of you that are subscribed to this channel. Everything you see around here is powered and empowered by your subscription to the channel. Thank you so much for your incredible love and support. None of this would be possible without you. It's a total co-creation. To all of you that haven't yet subscribed, please do take a moment. And interestingly, some of you think you are subscribed but haven't, so please do check. If you can see the subscribe button below, you're not subscribed, please do hit that subscribe button, hit the bell notification icon, and join the community, join the movement, spreading love, positivity, and wisdom like this around the planet together. Thank you so much in advance for your support. While we're also talking about support, there's the Inspired Circle. Don't forget, a community online that we've created here for like-minded, like-hearted souls. As we're moving through these shifts and changes, it's a very interesting time to be alive. We thought it incumbent upon us to offer in a really safe space where people can come together, meditate together once a week, community sharings once a week. Community members get to offer their sharings in and around to each other as well. So if you're stepping into something beautiful, come share with us. And once a month, you get to sit down with guests like Abke. He's next month. He's going to come on and answer any questions that you have directly. So I step out of the way and you as the audience members get to ask your questions directly to the guests, but only on the inside at the Inspired Circle. If you feel the call, join us there. It'll be super beautiful to welcome you into the deeper heart of this community. On screen now for you to take your journey onwards, upwards, and inwards even further. Episodes to continue your inspired evolution journey. So go on, take your pick and make your click. I will see you in the next one. I'll see you there.